Hi, this is the story of the first commission piece that I made 3 years ago. Because of the budget, I chose a walnut slab that had really nice figure but also lots of imperfections. And those imperfections started popping up as I was flattening the slab. Here's a big crack running through the entire width. We also have a chainsaw cut here that will define the max dimensions of the table. I trimmed the table to its size, so most of the cracks and sapwood went away. And see that missing piece? Because we are doing big roundovers, I was even able to include a little bit more of the figured part. The round corners were an interesting challenge. Since I didn't have a router bit with bearing or a copy bushing, I had to get creative. In the end, I just found a round dish that I hot glued to the table surface and ran my router base against it. If it's stupid, but it works, it's not stupid, huh? I took several passes on each corner, lowering the bit little by little, and got nice roundovers in the end. And time for epoxy. Here is a torch to blow the bubbles, a kitchen scale, the epoxy, a small mixing jar, the pigment, and chopsticks to have some sushi while the epoxy cures. Nah, forget it. Disposable chopsticks are perhaps the easiest mixing device to get and quite convenient to use when you mix small amounts of epoxy. If I need to mix up to say 1 liter, I use them chopsticks and always get a nice result and very few bubbles. The trick is using both of them, not just one. Okay, so I'm mixing the epoxy and adding pigment until I like the color, and then giving it another energetic stir. I find the syringe very useful when filling the small cracks and cavities, as it helps me pour the epoxy exactly where I need it. Also, it can usually be cleaned after the epoxy dries and used a few more times. To seal the cracks, I use just a regular cheap glue tape cross-glued in several layers. Since it is transparent, I can control the epoxy reaching everywhere I need it to reach. And this is how the bronze powder pigment looks on larger pours. I personally do not quite like the black epoxy and walnut combo that many folks on YouTube are using these days, so I find the bronze powder most suitable for walnut because the color is from the same palette and it has its own curl that rhymes nicely with the walnut grain figure. The epoxy cured just fine, but there are a couple interesting moments. First, some spots soaked more epoxy than the others, and I have yet to see if it also stained the wood. Second, there are spots of epoxy on the other side, and they are not even where I poured the epoxy. My best guess is that the epoxy traveled along the crack and showed up on the other surface. And by the way, this is why I use powder pigment and not a liquid stain for the epoxy. Could have been much worse. Anyways, I do a really light flattening pass to remove the epoxy excess. I have to be very careful. If I go too fast or too deep, the epoxy will tear out. Off camera, I trim the table to its final dimensions and spend some quality time sanding everything smoothly. And let's proceed to the finish. I put the first coat of Minwax oil. As you can see, it's also soaked in some spots more than in the others, but I will be sanding it down and putting 2 more coats. After looking at the hairpin legs, I realized the holes are not quite aligned on all the 4. So before putting the threaded inserts in, I marked the holes individually and scribed the ABCD letters on the legs and on the table. Phew, I was really proud of the result back then, and 3 years later, I still think this is a good side table. Thanks for watching, and see you soon.